Chapter 1. The Affair at Montreux. The Map That Led to Her Past. The waters of Lake Geneva lapped softly against the promenade, their rhythmic hush muffled beneath the glimmering festivities of the Hôtel du Mont Lac. It was late June, and the famed Montreux Music Gala had brought Europe's finest to the lavish lakeside retreat. Chandeliers glowed with golden warmth over the terrace, where champagne flutes clinked and laughter floated like perfume. But beneath the sparkle of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos, something unspoken hung in the air, a strange tightness like the final silence before a note breaks. From a corner of the ballroom, a woman in white stood quite still. She was not the sort of woman one forgot. Her beauty was not striking in the usual sense. It was bone-deep, with a timeless grace as if she had walked from an older, quieter world. Her name, whispered over caviar and piano chords, was Madame Célestine Durand. She had once been a renowned cartographer, they said, working for governments and collectors, vanishing from public life after her husband's sudden death years ago. Tonight she had reappeared, unannounced, ghost-like, at the gala's opening, wearing a gown the color of ash. Her fingers curled tightly around a small map case. She moved through the crowd like an echo, nods, small smiles, a voice too soft to carry. No one knew why she was here, or why her arrival had so deeply disturbed one of the gala's patrons, Mr. Lucien Favreau, the financier and benefactor of the music festival, who had been laughing heartily just moments before her appearance and now looked as though he had seen a ghost. He followed her out onto the terrace. What occurred in the next 20 minutes would become the stuff of whispers, scandal, and, eventually, murder. The terrace was empty when the maître d' arrived, alerted by a scream that had startled the harpist mid-sonata. There, under a lone parasol by the lake's edge, Madame Célestine lay sprawled across the mosaic floor, her white dress stained crimson, a paper map soaked through beneath her hand. A nearby table had been overturned. One wineglass remained standing. Lucien Favreau was nowhere to be seen. The police arrived within the hour, sealing off the hotel grounds. The guests were confined to the ballroom, their faces pale behind sequined masks of confusion. Most assumed it was a crime of passion, or perhaps an ill-timed robbery. A woman alone with a man she once knew, an argument, a push, a knife in the dark. But nothing was stolen. No money, no jewels, not even the map case beside her, which had been opened but left behind. It was Inspector Fournier who first noticed the peculiarity. There's no sign of forced entry, no broken lock. The map is not just any map. He lowered his voice to the local constable. Look here, this mark. It's an original drafting by Célestine herself. See the seal? It's her old symbol, the owl's eye. But the young constable only frowned. So? What does it lead to? Fournier narrowed his eyes. That's just it. I believe it doesn't lead to a place at all. I believe it leads to a time. 3 days later, a telegram arrived at Whitehaven Mansions, where Hercule Poirot was enjoying the company of his morning orchid and a perfectly soft-boiled egg. He examined the note with interest, setting aside his pince-nez. Death at a gala, he murmured. A woman of maps, and a man who has disappeared into thin air. Most curious, most irregular. Hastings looked up from the armchair. Sounds like a domestic quarrel, Poirot. Non, mon ami, Poirot replied, tapping the telegram with one finger. There is something not domestic about it at all. Look, Madame Durand, recluse of 15 years, reappears holding a map she herself designed. Within the hour, she is dead, and the man who once ruined her reputation, he vanishes like smoke. The map remains. You think it's important? I think, Poirot said softly, that a woman does not carry a map into a ballroom without purpose. I think the past has returned, and someone feared it. He turned to the telephone. Book us a passage to Montreux? We must see the Hôtel du Mont Lac at once. By the time they arrived, the press had already descended. Rumors fluttered like sparrows. Some claimed Madame Durand had hidden Nazi treasures in the Alps. Others whispered that the map was forged, a desperate attempt to reclaim her reputation. But Poirot, with his shining shoes and immaculate moustache, was not concerned with gossip. He studied the map under the soft light of the inspector's office. It was aged, its edges curled, with delicate annotations in fine ink, notations only a master cartographer would understand. But one mark stood out, a small hand-drawn crescent in the upper right corner, overlaid with a symbol like an hourglass tipped sideways. Poirot raised his eyebrows. "It is not merely geographic, it is symbolic." The inspector nodded gravely. She called it the map that led to her past, but what part of her past, we do not know. Poirot stepped closer, his voice low. Madame Durand came here not to escape, but to reveal. This map, this evening, was her confession. He turned toward the open window, where the wind off the lake carried the faint scent of lavender and something older, like forgotten ink or the breath of a story long hidden. Someone feared what she would unveil, he said. Someone who could not allow the past to speak. He tapped the map one final time. And so, the map was preserved, but the woman who drew it was not. Chapter 2. The first clues. The Hôtel du Mont Lac seemed to hold its breath in the wake of tragedy. What had once been an opulent retreat now echoed with the slow steps of guests too afraid to speak, waiters too nervous to serve, and constables who glanced over their shoulders with unease. Though the furnishings remained pristine, marble floors gleaming, chandeliers flickering in perfect symmetry, Poirot felt a tension beneath the surface. Like a room sealed too long, where the air had begun to sour. Madame Durand was seated here, said Inspector Fournier, gesturing to the lakeside terrace where a table still stood half-cleared, its linen cloth caught in the breeze. Witnesses say she came alone. Lucien Favreau arrived 10 minutes later. Poirot circled the table, his hands tucked behind his back, observing not the crime scene but the way it had been lived in. 2 wine glasses, one barely touched, a fold in the tablecloth, as though someone had gripped it in distress. A single butter knife resting too far from the bread plate. "And no one saw them quarrel?" he asked quietly. "No raised voices," Fournier replied. "But the maître d' said Favreau was pale when he approached the table. Sweating, in fact." Poirot tapped the corner of his mouth. He was afraid before the crime. Not after. Across the garden path, Hastings stood with the hotel's night porter, a young man in stiff uniform, his brow furrowed with confusion. "She asked for the south salon before dinner," the porter murmured. "It's rarely used, quiet, dim, hardly anyone goes there. She sat alone for over an hour, said she was waiting for someone, but didn't say who." Poirot turned sharply. "Did anyone join her?" The porter hesitated. "No, at least not that I saw, but I did find something odd after she left." He reached into his jacket and handed over a folded sheet of paper. Poirot opened it slowly. It was a partial copy of the same map found at the scene, this fragment bearing only an isolated peak, circled in red, with 3 initials sketched faintly below. LFS. Poirot nodded, thoughtful. "Merci." Back inside the hotel, they were led to Madame Durand's suite. It had already been searched by local police, but Poirot insisted on seeing it himself. The suite was immaculate, her suitcase untouched, as though she'd only planned to stay a single night. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot murmured, pointing to the dressing table. "The mirror is angled too sharply. Not toward the window, but the door. A woman fearful of someone's arrival, perhaps. And here," he lifted a brooch box from the drawer. Inside was a small brass compass, its surface well worn, the needle twitching faintly. "A cartographer's companion," Hastings said. "Oui, but not for navigation, for memory. A memento, perhaps." Poirot turned his attention to the wastebasket. Within it lay crumpled receipts, hotel stationery, and at the bottom, a torn envelope, its edge blackened as if someone had tried to burn it. He fished it out carefully. The name on the return address was faint, but still legible. Chateau Valency, Ardèche. Not Montreux, Poirot whispered. Not even close. Someone sent her something, Hastings said. Something she didn't want found. Or something she did want found, Poirot replied, but not until she had spoken to Favreau. The pieces, still scattered, had begun to shimmer faintly at the edges, but Poirot knew better than to press too soon. There were questions that lingered like fog. Why bring the map into public? What did she expect to happen, and what was Lucien Favreau running from? Back in the ballroom, Poirot asked to see the guest registry. The concierge, a stiff man with polished manners and polished shoes, produced the record with a flourish. Poirot scanned the pages, tracing the names not with his finger, but with his eye, noting who had checked in the same day as Celestine. He said at last. Mademoiselle Irene Lavelle, from Marseille, Mr. Oscar Gerber, antiques dealer, and, voila, Mr. Gregor Van, journalist, all recent arrivals. And all potential witnesses? Hastings asked. Or accomplices, or red herrings, Poirot said calmly. The plot, as they say, thickens. He closed the book gently, tapping it once with a fingertip. But I will tell you what stands out most. Yes. Poirot leaned in slightly. There is no record of Favreau checking in at all. They found Favreau's assistant, Émile Barras, in the hotel lounge, nervously scribbling notes in a leather-bound ledger. He was a thin man in his early 30s, with trembling fingers and a voice that cracked under even mild questioning. Mr. Favreau came on short notice, Émile explained. He didn't register formally. He owns a share of the hotel. Comes and goes when he pleases. I was to book the room under my name. You have seen him since the murder? Poirot asked. No. He told me to wait, that he needed time. But I haven't heard from him in days. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You say time. Did he say why? Émile hesitated. He said, The past is here, Émile. She's brought it with her. Poirot straightened slowly. Ah, then the past was never buried. It was only waiting. That night, Poirot returned to the terrace alone. The moon lay flat upon the lake like a silver coin, and somewhere far off, a heron cried out once, then was silent. He walked to the edge of the mosaic floor where Madame Durand had fallen. Kneeling gently, he examined the stone again, not for blood, not for drama, but for precision. His fingers traced the cracks near the parasol base. There, barely noticeable, was the thin outline of an earring, half-moon in shape, pressed into the mortar. Not Celestine's. Hers were pearl. Poirot pocketed it carefully. As he rose, he looked out across the lake. There is always a reason, he murmured, when someone returns after 15 years. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. By the following morning, the Hôtel du Mont-Lac had resumed a quiet, manicured calm. The jazz pianist played as scheduled in the breakfast room, and guests drifted in wearing polite faces and heavy eyes, each whispering as though the murder had been some strange dream from which they'd awoken in pressed linen and polished shoes. Yet Poirot knew better. Underneath the soft music and marmalade, suspicion had rooted itself deep. It was time to gather them. Inspector Fournier had secured the hotel's south salon for interviews, a discreet wood-paneled chamber that opened onto the garden and offered just enough intimacy to unnerve the guilty. Poirot entered at precisely 9 o'clock, with Hastings at his side and a small notebook in his palm. One by one, the key figures began to arrive. First, Mademoiselle Irene Lavelle, the opera soprano from Marseille, swept in like a stage entrance, dark curls pinned high, sunglasses perched like shields over her eyes. She wore a silk shawl with hand-embroidered dragons, the sort of garment one chooses when one wants to be noticed, or when one wants to distract. "I did not know Madame Durand," she said crisply, though her French bore the smallest trace of hesitation. "I only arrived the evening before for the gala. I sing tomorrow night." "Then you did not attend the terrace reception?" Poirot asked. She smiled thinly. "Briefly. The terrace was very crowded. I find such things exhausting." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "And yet you brought with you a rather personal gift. Rose orchids for the late Madame Durand's room." Her lips parted, just slightly. "I enjoy sending flowers," she replied. "It was a coincidence. I saw her name on the door. But you said you did not know her." Her fingers tightened around her clutch. "She once gave a lecture at the university I attended. Cartography and memory. A long time ago, I admired her work." Poirot made a small note. "It is often in admiration that the seeds of resentment grow, mademoiselle." Her sunglasses, for the first time, were removed. The eyes beneath them were cold. Next came Mr. Oscar Gerber, the antiques dealer with stiff shoulders and an even stiffer collar. He smelled faintly of varnish and tobacco and walked as though he carried centuries on his back. "She was a recluse," he said bluntly, "but not forgotten. Her maps fetch exorbitant prices among my clients." "And you knew she would be here?" "No, but I hoped." "You traveled from Berne, did you not?" Poirot asked. "Yet your reservation was made only hours before you arrived." Gerber's mouth tightened. "I received word that a Durand original would be unveiled. I assumed it would be at auction. Had I known she herself would be present, I might have thought twice." "Why?" asked Hastings. "Because the woman's name carries more ghosts than maps. She vanished for a reason, monsieur. Some say scandal, others say war secrets." Poirot folded his hands. "And what do you say, Monsieur Gerber?" The dealer looked away. "I say she brought danger with her." The third suspect was Gregor Van, a sharp-eyed journalist from Geneva, whose pen poked out of his breast pocket like a loaded weapon. He entered without invitation, sat without being asked, and began speaking before anyone addressed him. "She sent me a letter," he said. Poirot blinked. "Pardon?" Gregor tapped the pocket of his coat and produced a square envelope, the kind used for personal correspondence. "Postmarked 3 weeks ago. I never responded. I thought it was a hoax." Poirot opened it carefully. Inside was a single line handwritten in green ink. "I have something that must be seen. Meet me where the water remembers." "She knew I covered Cold War disappearances," Gregor added. "Maps, ciphers, coded locations, my bread and butter. I assumed it was a publicity stunt. But you came anyway. Curiosity, or guilt. I knew her name. My father may have worked with her once." Poirot's eyes glinted. "You say may. I was never told, but I recognized the signature. The owl's eye." Poirot studied the young man a moment longer. He had the look of someone constantly waiting for applause, or punishment. Then came Émile Barre, still pale and damp at the temples. He hovered in the doorway like a man waiting for absolution, his ledger clutched to his chest. "I swear I don't know what happened," he whispered. "Lucienne never told me what she wanted." "Did they speak before the terrace meeting?" Poirot asked. Émile shook his head. "No. But I overheard part of a phone call. Lucien took it late that afternoon. He sounded afraid." "Do you remember what he said?" "Just a few words. He said, 'She's not bluffing, not this time.'" Poirot tilted his head. "And what was your impression of their history?" Émile hesitated. "Lucien always said she was the most brilliant person he ever met, and the most dangerous. And yet he never reported her reappearance. He said no one would believe him," Émile whispered. Finally, a guest not on any list appeared. An elderly woman entered the salon unannounced, her frame delicate, her cane carved with intricate flowers. She wore a brooch shaped like a crescent moon. Poirot rose at once. "Madame," she nodded. "I am Marguerite Sylvestre. I was once her closest friend." She sat without waiting to be offered a chair. "She told me she would die," Marguerite said quietly. "She said, when I walk into that ballroom, someone will remember too much." "And why did she go?" "Because she wanted her name back. She wanted the world to know the truth." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "What truth?" Marguerite met his gaze. "That Lucien Favreau did not ruin her by chance. He used her maps, sold the secrets within them to those who would pay in silence. She fled to protect what remained of her integrity." "She returned to expose him." Marguerite leaned forward. "She returned to find the other names." Lucien was not alone. As the salon emptied, Poirot stood by the fire, his hands pressed together in thought. Hastings approached. "They're all hiding something," Hastings murmured. "But it still feels as though we're missing the key." Poirot nodded slowly. "We are not missing it, mon ami. We are watching it dance across the room in silence. The question is not who benefits from Madame Durand's death. It is, who was terrified by what she had rediscovered." He gazed once more at the copy of the map, still spread on the table, the red-circled peak winking faintly in the morning light. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. The morning mist clung to the lake like gauze as Hercule Poirot and Hastings stepped from the stone archway of the Hôtel du Mont-Lac and into the still garden. The air was heavy with scent. Roses, damp pine, and something subtler, the faint, acrid trace of fear. Guests strolled politely, pretending not to glance in their direction, though their eyes followed Poirot's every movement. It was no longer the music gala they had come to enjoy. It was a stage now, and Poirot, unmistakably, had become its central figure. They had interviewed the obvious. They had walked the visible paths. Now Poirot wished to feel the scene. "Tell me, Hastings," Poirot said softly as they passed the shaded gravel path leading to the boathouse. "When one person returns to the world after 15 years of silence, what might compel such a decision?" "Guilt? Nostalgia?" Hastings offered. "A desire to set things right?" "No. It is fear. But not fear of being found. It is fear of being forgotten." He paused before the terrace once again. The broken parasol had been removed, but the blood-stained tile beneath it remained visible beneath a square of white muslin, as though the hotel hoped to forget its own floor was now part of a murder scene. Poirot knelt down slowly. The half-moon earring he had discovered the night before still lay in his coat pocket, wrapped in a linen handkerchief. He turned it over in his hand. Silver, finely worked, but distinctively modern in style. Not Celestine's. Then whose? Rising, he turned to the garden's edge, where a single figure stood alone. It was Mademoiselle Irene Lavelle, standing at the stone balustrade in a robe of pale blue silk, staring across the water. She didn't turn as he approached. "You're a singer of great talent," Poirot said gently, "and a woman who understands presence, but also silence." She turned slowly. "Inspector Fournier already asked me his questions." "But I am not Inspector Fournier," Poirot said mildly, "and I am not interested in rehearsed answers." Her fingers tightened on the balustrade. "I barely knew her. Yet you remembered her lecture, you remembered her map, and you sent her flowers under false pretenses." Her chin rose. "It wasn't false. I admired her." "Did you admire her skill or her secrets?" She said nothing. Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do you recognize this?" He held out the linen-wrapped earring. Irene's hand flinched, just barely. A twitch, not a reach. But enough. "It's not mine." "No? But you admire crescent shapes," he said. glancing at her silver necklace. "Another curve, another moon. I am not the only woman with taste, Monsieur Poirot." He nodded. "No, but you may be the only woman here whose fear is wrapped so artfully in deflection." She said nothing, but when he turned to leave, her voice halted him. "She ruined someone powerful. Years ago, I don't know how or why, but she ruined him." Poirot turned slowly. "Who?" "I don't know. But the way people spoke about her in Marseille, they said she had been a danger once, that she disappeared because someone had given her a choice, vanish or be destroyed." She looked down at the water. Maybe she chose both. Later that afternoon, Poirot and Hastings walked the lower corridors of the hotel, the staff hallways, the delivery entrance, the places no guest ever visited. Poirot had requested access to the security records, but there were none. "No cameras on the south side," Fournier admitted. "Too old a wing. They never updated it." "Convenient," murmured Poirot. They emerged into the hallway near the wine cellar, where they nearly collided with Oscar Gerber, the antiques dealer, who looked flustered and out of breath. "My apologies," Gerber muttered. "I was looking for the library." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "The library is on the opposite side of the hotel, monsieur." Gerber hesitated. "Ah, of course." Hastings eyed the antique dealer's gloved hands. "Strange thing to wear indoors, don't you think?" Gerber didn't respond. He offered a stiff bow and retreated down the hall without another word. Poirot waited until he was gone before glancing at a nearby door, one labeled "Private Storage." He opened it with a soft push. Inside, in the half-dark, were stacks of unopened wine crates, folded linens, and on one shelf a copy of a map, the same style, the same delicate inkwork. This one, however, was torn in half. Poirot held it up to the light. The missing section was precisely where the circled mountain peak had been. "Hastings," he said quietly, "there is more than one map." By evening, Poirot had returned to Madame Durand's suite. He sat in the chair she had last used, facing the mirror, angled toward the door. On the desk lay her compass, the brass worn down from decades of use. He turned it gently in his palm. Why did she come here with a map? Why make her presence known when she had spent years in hiding because she wanted to be seen? But more than that, she wanted to trigger someone's fear. Her map had not been an invitation to explore. It had been a mirror, showing others their own buried past. He rose and stepped to the window. Below, the garden lights flickered to life, the terrace restored to elegance as if no death had ever occurred there. But Poirot knew that a crime such as this was never confined to one moment. It echoed backward and forward. Madame Durand had not simply returned to settle scores. She had returned to unearth something someone had buried with precision, and that someone was still watching. Chapter 5. Initial Interviews. Begin. The next morning broke under a veil of grey clouds, casting a sombre hue over the Hôtel du Mont-Lac. A breeze stirred the lake in anxious ripples, as though it too sensed the weight of something still buried. Poirot rose early, dressed impeccably in a dove-grey suit with a silk pocket square, and requested the south salon be prepared once more, not for a general gathering, but for private interviews. One by one the suspects would return, and this time Poirot would not allow them to hide behind polished smiles or half-true stories. Hastings, notebook in hand, sat just behind Poirot as the first suspect entered. Oscar Gerber stepped forward stiffly, his coat freshly pressed, the scent of pipe tobacco clinging faintly to the air around him. "Monsieur Gerber," Poirot said softly, "yesterday you claimed to know little of Madame Durand personally, yet we found a torn copy of one of her maps hidden in the cellar. Care to explain how it got there?" Gerber's jaw tightened. Anyone could have left it there. Indeed. But we found glove fibers on the parchment edge. Soft leather, French cut, much like the gloves you wear even now. I sell antiques. I wear gloves to protect them. Of course, Poirot said gently. But you see, monsieur, the map in question was not one from any collection. It was a working draft, hand-inked by Madame Durand, likely in the last year. It never passed through auction. So how did a collector such as yourself come into possession of something that was never made public? Gerber hesitated. I purchased it privately. From whom? I cannot say. Cannot or will not? Gerber's mouth moved, but no words came. Poirot leaned forward. Let me guess. You were promised exclusivity, a rare Durand original, only you would own it. But then, she reappeared, with a map even more valuable, and worse, it contradicted yours, did it not? Gerber's eyes flickered. Yes, Poirot said softly, because yours was altered, a forgery built upon stolen fragments. Gerber looked away. I didn't kill her. Poirot nodded calmly, but perhaps someone else feared what her true map would expose. Next came Irina Lavelle, her expression composed, her manner aloof. She wore a simple white blouse, but her earrings had changed. Today, she wore pearls. I see the crescents are gone, Poirot remarked. Do you accuse me of something, Monsieur Poirot? I accuse you of being afraid, he said evenly. You once studied under Madame Durand's teachings, did you not? Her lips thinned. Briefly. At a conference in Aix-en-Provence. She was cruel. How so? She told me I lacked the imagination for meaningful work. That I copied too much, never innovated. She embarrassed me, publicly. And yet you sent her orchids, because she was still the best. Poirot studied her. The woman you once loathed, whose approval you still sought. She came here with a map, one that exposed truths hidden for decades. Was your fear that the map revealed something personal? I didn't even know what was on the map, she said coldly. Then why did you say she had ruined someone powerful? Irina hesitated. That was rumor. I was warned to stay away from her. By whom? My uncle, she said quietly. He once worked in defense. She sold something dangerous years ago. They hushed it up. I never knew the details. Ah, Poirot said. So you feared not what she carried, but what it might reveal about your own family's past. She looked away. I didn't kill her, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot gave the faintest smile. But you resented her. Perhaps not enough to draw blood, but enough to withhold the truth. The third to arrive was Gregor Van, the journalist. He entered with a notebook under one arm, a fresh ink stain on his cuff, and the eager tension of a man who has questions of his own. I've done some digging, he said before Poirot could speak. Durand worked for the Swiss government in the 80s, mapping old Cold War tunnels in the Jura Mountains. One of her projects, classified. Yes, Poirot said. And what did you hope to find in that? Stories no one else could print. Maybe evidence of a cover-up. Maybe proof she was more than a map-maker. You received her letter. Yes, and I regret not responding. Poirot studied him. Did you know your father may have worked with her? I guessed, but he never spoke about those years. Then perhaps, Poirot said gently, her letter was not an invitation to investigate. It was a summons to finish something your father never could. Van frowned. You think I'm hiding something? I think you are struggling with guilt, Poirot said softly. You came too late. Now you fear what the map might say about your family, your profession, or your own integrity. Gregor Van was silent for a moment. I didn't kill her, he said. But I do think someone in this hotel is here to make sure no one else ever reads what was on that map. Finally, Poirot called in Émile Barras, the trembling assistant to Lucien Favreau. He looked worse than before, his tie crooked, his complexion chalky, as if he hadn't slept since the night of the murder. "You are still loyal to your employer," Poirot observed, "even now." "I have no choice," Emile murmured. "I signed papers. I manage accounts. He's persuasive." "Where is he?" "I don't know." "You mean you have not seen him, but surely he has made contact." Emile hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he pulled a folded napkin from his breast pocket. Inside it was a note, scrawled in ink. "Emile, it is done. The map is no longer a threat. Stay silent. You will be protected." Hastings frowned. "No signature." "But a fingerprint," Poirot said, holding the paper to the light. "Smeared, but not invisible." He turned to Emile. "He writes it is done. And yet the map remains. So what, Monsieur Barras, was done?" Emile swallowed hard. I think he believed she wouldn't speak, that she'd be frightened off. But when she didn't leave, he panicked," Poirot finished, "and made a fatal choice." Emile shuddered. He didn't mean for her to die. He wanted to silence her, yes, but not like this. Poirot stood. She died because silence had become more dangerous than truth. After the interviews, Poirot returned to his suite. He stared once more at the fragment of map, the circled peak, the initials LFS, and the compass still ticking quietly on the desk. He now understood what Madame Durand had done. She had embedded a story within the geography. A cartographer's code. Her revenge was not just against Favreau, but against every lie that had buried her truth. And somewhere, in the winding trails of the Alps or the shaded rooms of this hotel, that truth still waited to be found. Chapter 6. First False Lead. The next day, the Hôtel du Mont Lac was overcome by a strange stillness, a deceptive hush, as if the lake and mountains themselves were waiting to exhale. Word had quietly spread among the guests that a breakthrough in the investigation had occurred. Inspector Fournier, fueled by mounting political pressure and a desire to deliver swift results, had summoned Poirot to the office adjoining the reception hall. As Hastings and Poirot entered, Fournier was already speaking to a gendarme, his tone clipped with urgency. "There is no doubt," he said, holding a slim file with the triumphant posture of a man who believed the answer had at last revealed itself. The prints on the napkin match those in the Swiss database. Lucien Favreau, but that is not all. He snapped his fingers, and the gendarme placed a box on the desk. Inside lay a compact Beretta pistol, found concealed behind a loose stone in the garden wall. It was still wrapped in oilcloth, but the serial number had been partially scratched off. "It's unregistered." And Fournier lifted a thin plastic envelope containing a handkerchief embroidered with the initials LF. "We found this beside it." Hastings leaned closer. "You believe Favreau shot her?" Fournier nodded. "One clean wound, high velocity, small caliber." She collapsed immediately. "The angle matches, and the weapon, we believe, was planted close enough to dispose of in a panic." "But the handkerchief," Poirot murmured, lifting the edge of the linen carefully between two fingers. "It is too clean, too deliberate." Fournier frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Poirot said slowly, "that a man attempting to hide his guilt does not leave behind a monogram token, unless he wants to be caught. You're suggesting it was planted? I am suggesting it was meant to be found." Poirot set the handkerchief down gently. "The killer wants us to believe Favreau acted alone, that he killed Madame Durand in fear and fled. But such a conclusion is too neat." Fournier crossed his arms. "Poirot, we have a murder weapon, fingerprints, motive, and means." "And yet," Poirot replied calmly, "we have no witness to the act, only a web of assumptions and one well-timed clue." He turned and walked toward the window, where the rain had begun to mist the glass. "Favreau is guilty of something," Poirot said, "but not necessarily this." That afternoon, a knock came at Poirot's suite. It was Marguerite Sylvestre, Madame Durand's elderly friend, dressed in mourning black and carrying a folded letter. "I found this," she said softly, "hidden in the lining of Celestine's old cartography case. I don't believe it was meant for me." Poirot accepted the letter gently. The handwriting was Celestine's. Elegant, deliberate, filled with restraint. "If anything happens to me, the truth lies not in the map's geography, but in its symmetry. Follow the symbols, you will find the betrayal buried in their pattern, not their terrain." LFS Poirot read it twice. Then he handed it to Hastings without a word. "She knew she would not survive," he said at last. "She didn't come here for resolution. She came to set a trap." Marguerite lowered her gaze. "I begged her to stay away, but she said the map was the only proof she had, that someone had altered her original design, hidden a message within the fake, and used it for decades to profit from deception." Poirot's mind raced. The forgery. Favreau was the first suspect, Marguerite said. But he never had the mind for symbology. Someone else redrew her work, someone close. Poirot's gaze grew distant. "The symmetry," he murmured. That evening, Poirot requested to see both the forged map found in the cellar and the authentic version retrieved from Madame Durand's body. He laid them out side by side in the south salon, closing the doors and turning on the overhead lamps one by one until the room was bathed in golden clarity. The contrast was subtle, but damning. Where the real map bore fluid topography, organic notations, and minor imperfections, the forged one was too perfect. The lines mirrored one another with mathematical precision, as if created by tracing. "There," Poirot said, tapping a point near the circled mountain on the fake. "A mirrored owl symbol. But on the original, nothing." Hastings peered closer. "What does it mean?" "It is not a location," Poirot whispered. "It is a signature, hidden among the folds. Someone left their mark in the imitation, smugly tucked away." He retrieved the compass from Madame Durand's case. When aligned over the mirrored peaks, the needle pointed, not north, but directly toward the crescent-shaped symbol in the margin. "The same shape as the earring I found." Hastings blinked. "You think the forger was a woman?" Poirot didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked to the salon's window and stared into the descending fog. Someone designed a trap within a forgery, and Celestine uncovered it. That is why she came here. Not to expose a crime, but to reveal an artist, the forger, the one whose signature lives in geometry and ink. He turned back toward the maps, voice low and grave. "And that forger is here, watching us now." Hours later, Inspector Fournier returned with news. Lucien Favreau had been found. In a rented flat across the lake, half-empty wine bottles scattered across the floor, a newspaper folded to the obituaries. "He says he was waiting for the truth to come out," Fournier explained. "Swears he didn't kill her." Poirot nodded slowly. "Did he confess to stealing her work?" "Not directly. He said, 'We all profited from her disappearance. Some of us more than others.'" Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. Then he spoke, not to Fournier, but to himself. The map was a warning. The forgery was a riddle. But the killer, mon ami, the killer feared the truth behind the style, not the land, not the ink. He placed the forged map back in its folder, hands moving delicately as if folding a shroud. "One mystery has been resolved," Poirot said quietly. Favreau was not the murderer. He turned to Hastings, his expression unreadable. "But another has just begun." Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The rain had not stopped. It drifted down like memory, soft, unyielding, and ancient. From the south-facing window of his suite, Poirot watched as droplets traced thin lines over the glass, mimicking the very contour lines of the map that now haunted his every thought. Outside, The lake curled into itself like a secret. And somewhere within the echo of that quiet storm, Poirot knew a mind was unraveling, one not his own. "The killer is not afraid of the crime," Poirot murmured. "They're afraid of being misunderstood." Hastings, seated nearby with the latest hotel ledger, looked up. "What do you mean by that, Poirot?" Poirot turned from the window, his hands behind his back. "A forger is not only a thief, they are an artist, and artists, true artists, crave recognition even in anonymity. Madame Durand's murder was not only a silencing, it was a war between two signatures, hers and another's." Hastings frowned. "So you think the killer feels they were entitled to her work?" "Non," Poirot replied. "I think the killer believes their improvement of her work was justified, perhaps even superior." He tapped the desk gently. "It is time to provoke the artist." Later that day, Poirot requested that the hotel host a private viewing in the South Salon. The excuse, a memorial tribute to Madame Durand's cartographic legacy. Maps, both her known works and the mysterious, recently recovered drafts, would be displayed under glass. Subtly, Poirot asked that the forged version be misattributed as authentic, while the real map would be marked simply as unverified. Guests gathered by invitation only. Inspector Fournier watched from a corner, suspicious but silent. Hastings stood near the entry, notebook in hand. The atmosphere was curiously reverent, whispers and slow steps, like a chapel holding its breath. Poirot observed them all. Irena Lavelle, graceful in velvet, paused too long before the forged map. Her eyes narrowed, not in grief, but in judgment. Her lips moved faintly, as if she were mouthing corrections. Oscar Gerber circled the table, hands clasped, eyes scanning the frame joints. He made no comment, only the occasional, unconscious twitch of his jaw. Gregor Van stood stiffly near the far end, scribbling in his notepad, occasionally glancing sideways at Irena, as if waiting for her to speak. And Emile Barras stood apart, arms folded tightly. Expression unreadable, but his eyes watered as they hovered over the real map, not the forgery. Poirot stepped forward then and addressed the room with quiet composure. "Mesdames et messieurs, these maps were created over decades. They are not merely ink and paper. They are reflections of choices, of betrayals, of lives altered by silence. One of these," he gestured, "is authentic. The other, a deliberate imitation." Murmurs passed among the guests. Oscar's brows lifted. Irena tilted her head. Van smiled faintly. "I pose to you a question," Poirot said, his voice smooth, almost gentle. "Which is more dangerous, the truth or the impression of truth?" He let the question hang in the air. Then he turned and walked toward the forged map. "I once knew an artist," Poirot continued, "who said the thrill of creation comes not from producing something new, but from hiding oneself so well in imitation that no one could tell. But that artist would always make one mistake, one tiny flourish to prove they had been there." He tapped the map's lower edge, where the mirrored owl symbol lay faint but intentional. "Whoever created this map did not copy Madame Durand. They rivaled her." He turned slowly. "And that, I suspect, is what terrified her most." The gathering dissolved soon after, but the tension lingered. Poirot retreated to the lounge, where he ordered tisane and waited. One by one, the guests departed the salon. Most avoided his eyes, but one did not. Irena. She crossed the room slowly, her steps deliberate, her expression unreadable. "You set a trap," she said softly, sitting opposite him. Poirot smiled gently. "Did I? You know that wasn't her map. Anyone who studied her work would know. It lacks her fluidity, her spatial rhythm." "Precisely," Poirot said. Silence. Irena looked away. "Then why call it hers?" "To see who would correct me." Her eyes flicked back toward him. Cold, glittering. You think I forged it? I think you admired her, Poirot replied, and that you longed to prove yourself, to show that your skill, too, could whisper across mountains and valleys. I never claimed to be her equal. No, he agreed, but you hoped she would one day say it, and when she didn't, you spoke through ink instead. Her voice dropped. Are you accusing me of murder? Poirot leaned forward. I'm observing, mademoiselle, how fiercely you defend a forgery you claim not to have made. She stood, her breath sharp. Be careful, Monsieur Poirot. You're dancing dangerously close to slander. And then she walked away. Later that night, Poirot and Hastings returned to their suite. The rain had ceased. The lake was still. But Poirot's mind was racing. She is close to breaking, he said. Hastings frowned. Do you truly think she's the forger? Perhaps, Poirot murmured. But even if she's not the killer, she is protecting someone who signs in ink but kills in silence. He turned to the map once more. It is all here, Hastings. Every lie, every betrayal, and the final clue is not in the geography. His eyes locked on the compass, but in the way the needle never points where we expect. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The wind shifted that morning. The lake no longer murmured gently. Instead, its surface jittered in sharp staccato ripples under a brooding sky. Poirot, already dressed and immaculately groomed, stepped onto the hotel's upper veranda with a gravity that Hastings had come to recognize. It was the weight of a mind drawing taut threads together, delicate, precise, and dangerous if pulled too soon. But something new had disturbed the web. Poirot turned to Hastings. You remember the young housekeeper, the one who fetched Marguerite Sylvestre's coat during the tribute yesterday? Yes. What of her? She's missing. Hastings blinked. Missing? Vanished sometime during the early hours of the morning, Poirot said. Left her uniform behind. Her passport is still in the staff locker. No sign of departure. No message. A runaway? Poirot shook his head. No. A witness. He tapped the railing lightly with one gloved finger. She had no reason to be near the salon during the map tribute, and yet she lingered, watched, listened. Hastings frowned. You think she saw something? I think, Poirot said carefully. She recognized someone, or something, and now she's gone. The discovery of the missing girl cast a new chill over the Hôtel du Mont-Lac. Inspector Fournier doubled the patrols. The lake dock was searched. Her name, Annalisa Grunwald, was whispered across the breakfast tables with growing unease. But Poirot, while concerned, saw something more dangerous in the silence that followed her disappearance. Divers were called in. Nothing was found. But what surfaced instead, quite literally, was far stranger. Around midday, a groundskeeper clearing debris from the western edge of the lake reported a waterlogged satchel caught between two reeds. It was retrieved and delivered to Fournier. Inside, a sealed envelope, a strip of linen ribbon, and a broken fountain pen. The envelope, once opened, revealed a single sheet of paper, its ink mostly smudged by water, but one phrase still legible. The fake hides more than lines. It hides a second death. Poirot stared at it long and hard. A second death, he repeated. You think it's a confession? Hastings asked. Poirot shook his head. No, a warning. He gestured to the ribbon. It was torn lengthwise. Embroidered in its intact side was the emblem of the Hôtel du Mont-Lac. But the cut had been deliberate. A knife, not decay. Someone had wanted this message to reach them, but not intact. Poirot and Hastings returned to the salon once more, the now empty room echoing faintly with the scent of rosewood and the ghost of yesterday's performance. The maps remained under glass, though a single page, One of the early drafts, unsigned, was askew in its frame. Poirot noted it instantly. "This," he said, "was tampered with." Hastings leaned in. "It's been moved." "Yes, but not just moved. Repositioned to conceal a detail. Look at the legend in the lower corner." Hastings squinted. "It's faint." "That symbol again. Owl's eye?" "No," Poirot said, voice tight. "It looks similar, but it's not. It's closed. The pupil has been shaded in." Hastings stared at him. "A second signature," Poirot said quietly. "Or perhaps a correction." He turned to the compass again, this time placing it deliberately at the center of the altered map. The needle swung, not north, but directly toward the same symbol despite its altered appearance. "Symmetry," Poirot said, almost to himself. "Not geography." Madame Durand's killer feared the structure of her map, not the content. Someone realized the forgery could reveal more than it concealed. He stood abruptly. "We must speak to Marguerite." Marguerite Sylvestre sat in the winter drawing room, her thin frame wrapped in shawls, a book of poetry open in her lap but unread. When Poirot and Hastings entered, she looked up slowly, as though expecting them. "You have more questions," she said simply. "Yes, madame," Poirot replied. "And I believe you already know what they are." She sighed, folding her hands. "Celestine told me she suspected someone had inserted more than artistic vanity into the forged maps," Marguerite said. "She believed there was a pattern, a secret correspondence between locations and events." "What kind of events?" "Disappearances," she said, "during the Cold War. Low-profile figures, 1 or 2 intelligence officers, a defector, a translator, all presumed accidents. But she believed they were targeted, that the forger had used her map to orchestrate something more." Poirot's face darkened. "A code, concealed in cartography." "She traced 7 symbols across 3 maps," Marguerite whispered. "She believed they corresponded to deaths." "Was Favreau aware?" Marguerite hesitated. "I don't think he understood the depth of it. He thought he was exploiting her reputation. He didn't see the deeper structure. But someone else did." Poirot turned away, hands behind his back, heart now racing. "And you're telling me this was not just an act of theft?" "No, Monsieur Poirot. It was an operation." Back in their suite, Poirot and Hastings sat in silence for several minutes. The maps were now laid across their writing desk. 7 symbols marked in tiny ink, scattered, innocuous unless read in a precise sequence. A pattern, a map of deaths. Hastings spoke first. "You think the girl, Annalise, discovered it too? She may have stumbled onto something, or someone believed she did." Poirot tapped the corner of the smudged note. "The fake hides more than lines. It hides a second death. Do you think another murder is coming?" Poirot didn't answer at first. Then slowly, he turned. "No, Hastings. I think it already happened." He paused. "And we never realized it was a murder at all." Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The storm had finally passed. The rain gave way to stillness, ominous, thick like the breath before a revelation. The lake shimmered once more, but with a strange mirrored silence. Everything reflected, yet nothing revealed. Poirot sat motionless in the corner of the lounge, sipping black coffee with the delicacy of a man avoiding a misstep. Hastings stood by the hearth, eyes scanning a page of marginalia copied from the altered map. 7 marks, Hastings muttered. 7 symbols. "You truly believe each corresponds to a death?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes. And not just any deaths, those that history conveniently forgot. Each marked location aligns with the site of an incident declared accidental or politically ambiguous during the final years of the Cold War. Madame Durand believed her original work had been weaponized. But if she had proof, Hastings said. Why wait 15 years to act on it? Because she did not realize it until recently, Poirot said. The forgery, the false map, was not merely a theft of credit. It was a cipher, and one she only cracked after a fragment of her work surfaced again. He leaned back. She returned here not to confront Favreau. She returned to confront the true author of the forgery. Their next step was delicate. Poirot asked Inspector Fournier to provide access to historical personnel files related to the Hôtel du Mont-Lac, particularly those from the 1990s. Fournier, reluctantly obliging, brought a folder from the municipal archives. This was a popular diplomatic retreat during the late stages of the Cold War, Fournier said, tapping the cover. Many guests under assumed names. We don't have full records. Poirot accepted the folder with a nod. He flipped through the pages, pausing occasionally, until his eyes settled on a particular entry. Camille Lavelle, registered in 1991, artist, accompanied by a miner. Poirot blinked. Lavelle. Irina, Hastings asked. Her mother, Poirot said quietly. Or sister. The resemblance is too strong to dismiss. And here, he pulled out a photocopied image, a woman with sharp eyes and hands stained with ink. Cartographer, Fournier supplied. She was rumored to have worked for the French ministry in an unofficial capacity, designed layouts, floor plans, low-clearance material. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet she stayed here. At the same time, Madame Durand was working in seclusion. He tapped the image again. This is our second signature. Poirot requested to see Irina Lavelle again. She arrived reluctantly, her manner stiffer than usual, her lips pressed into a polished calm. But her eyes betrayed it. That same tension, like a string drawn just before snapping. You requested me, she said coolly. Though I must confess, I'm growing weary of suspicion. Poirot gestured for her to sit. Forgive me, mademoiselle, but I must ask a question of blood. She raised an eyebrow. Of blood? Camille Lavelle, artist, guest of the Hôtel du Mont-Lac in 1991. She bore your name. Irina's face held steady for a second too long. She was my aunt, she said at last. My father's sister. And she was also a forger, Poirot said gently. Her gaze shifted. She was many things. Precise, obsessive, unacknowledged. Did she teach you? Poirot asked. Irina did not answer. He leaned forward. You see, mademoiselle, I believe Camille Lavelle was responsible for the false map. I believe she created it not as sabotage, but as a coded document, and I believe you have been protecting her legacy. She died 6 years ago, Irina said. Yet her work lives on, Poirot replied. And Madame Durand recognized her hand. That is why she returned. She came to accuse a ghost? Irina asked. She came to unearth a truth, Poirot said softly. But you were afraid, not because of what it revealed, but because you helped hide it. Irina stood, her poise cracking. She didn't kill anyone, she whispered. Poirot rose. Then tell me who did. She turned her face away. She only charted the pattern, Irina said at last. She told me, years later, that the map wasn't hers anymore. Someone had asked her to trace Celestine's designs, said it was for a commemorative exhibit. She believed them. Poirot's heart sank. She was used, he said. She realized it too late, Irina whispered. By the time she understood, people were dying. And then she vanished from public life, just like Celestine. Did she confess to you? No. She left me the ink plates, told me never to show them, that if anyone found out, we'd both be in danger. Poirot looked at her carefully. You believe Madame Durand's death was ordered? I think, she said slowly, that someone very powerful realized the pattern was being noticed again. Back in their suite, Hastings paced. Good Lord, Poirot, are you saying this goes beyond Lavelle? Beyond Favreau? Poirot sat in silence, fingers steepled, eyes distant. Yes, Hastings. I believe someone commissioned the forgery. Not as a forgery, but as a weapon. To trace movements, to record where certain people would be when. He pointed to the map. And now, Madame Durand's death, it is not just revenge, it is a continuation. Hastings frowned. Then who? Who would still be cleaning up secrets after all these years? Poirot stood. Someone who still lives within these halls. Someone who believed Annalisa Grunewald saw too much. He stepped to the balcony door and opened it slowly. Celestine left us a code, he said, but we have not broken it yet. He looked up at the darkening sky. And until we do, another death is possible. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. A quiet dread had settled over the Hôtel du Mont-Lac. Not the panicked flutter of a new crime, but a hush that clung to the corridors like damp mist. Something had shifted in the air, something hidden beneath the surface had stirred. Poirot noticed it first in the eyes of the staff. The bellboys moved faster. The concierge spoke more softly. The pianist skipped his usual morning piece in the lounge, and no one dared ask why. But Poirot did not speak of these things. Not yet. He was watching. It was nearly midday when he found what he needed. While reviewing the original maps in the South Salon, alone this time, Poirot noticed something he had overlooked. Something too minute, too intentional. It was not part of the terrain, not part of the legend. It was a scratch. Just beneath the inked crescent marking the disputed peak on Madame Durand's final map, Poirot saw it. A faint indentation, barely visible in the right light. Not made with a pen, but a compass point. A needle jabbed into the paper, then turned. A private mark. His brow furrowed. He took out the compass Madame Durand had left behind. The same instrument, no doubt. Worn, precise. When he pressed its tip against the faint mark and turned the housing, a second symbol emerged. An overlapping circle traced into the map through pressure, not ink. The line revealed a second location. Not the mountain, but a flat, unassuming area along the lakeshore, just north of the hotel. Poirot stood in silence. His eyes narrowed. "She marked it," he whispered. "But not for us." He returned to his suite, where Hastings had just returned from the marina. "There's still no word of the girl," Hastings said. "No sightings, no clues. Fournier's beginning to think she may have simply fled." "Non," Poirot said. "She was silenced, but not by violence. Not yet." He retrieved a sheet of tracing paper and carefully overlaid it on the map. With a pencil, he circled the second location, the one revealed by the compass pressure. "Madame Durand left us a clue no one else could read," he said. "A private message to herself, or to someone she trusted." Hastings squinted. "It's just trees. There's nothing there." "That is what someone wants us to believe," Poirot said. He retrieved the hotel's original blueprints from the concierge's archive, acquired discreetly under the guise of researching the estate's history. Spreading them beside the map, Poirot aligned both documents using the salon and terrace as shared points. The second circle, the hidden mark, aligned precisely with an old service annex, now abandoned. "Locked since 1998 due to renovations," Poirot said, tapping the note on the blueprint. "Shall we go?" Hastings asked. Poirot stood. "Not yet. I go alone." "Alone? That's madness." "Not madness," Poirot said gently. "Strategy." He put on his overcoat, adjusted his hat, and offered a smile. "Sometimes, Hastings, one must step into the shadow in order to lure what hides there into the light." The annex stood forgotten beneath ivy and the creeping fatigue of years. A tarnished lock hung on the rusted gate, but it had been broken recently, clumsily. Inside, the corridor still smelled of mildew and old paper. Poirot moved slowly. Boxes lay scattered. Linens, Empty bottles, disused signage. At the far end of the room, behind a half-collapsed shelving unit, sat a canvas map tube. Its seal cracked, its lid askew. Inside was a map, a third version. Poirot unrolled it delicately, even as his heartbeat quickened. It was a combination of the first two, Madame Durand's sweeping artistry and Camille Lavelle's rigid symmetry overlaid in a ghostly palimpsest. A single symbol, however, had been added in fresh ink within the second circle, the one Poirot had just discovered. A single name, Annalise. Poirot stood frozen. Mon Dieu, he breathed. She was the next. A creak echoed behind him. He turned slowly. A figure stood in the doorway, unshaven, pale, his coat damp from rain. Émile Barras. Poirot's voice was soft. You broke the lock. Émile looked exhausted, hollow-eyed. I didn't know I was in here, not until now. You lied, Poirot said, folding the map. Favreau never told you it was done. You wrote that note. You planted the gun. Émile's jaw clenched. I had to make it stop. Because you were part of it, Poirot whispered. Weren't you? Émile slumped against the doorframe. I didn't know what I was part of, not at first. I was just a clerk. I typed reports. I archived maps. I didn't realize they were using the layouts to plan disappearances, real ones. I thought I was protecting national interests. Poirot watched him, unmoving. But when Madame Durand resurfaced, Émile continued, I knew it would come undone. They would bury me too. I had no choice. I had to make it look like Favreau panicked. I planted the weapon. I wrote the note. But I swear, I didn't kill her. Then who did? Poirot asked, his voice calm, almost kind. Émile looked away. Someone higher, someone who's been hiding behind us all. I only cleaned up the mess. Poirot stepped forward. And Annalise? Émile's lips trembled. She found the box of map plates I hid behind the laundry chute. She never said anything, but I think she understood too much. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Where is she now? Émile paused. Alive? I think. I bribed a train porter to sneak her out, sent her towards Zurich. I told her, don't ever come back. Poirot closed his eyes. Relief flickered across his brow, but only for a moment. She's safe. For now. He looked down at the map once more. But the killer is still here. Poirot returned to the hotel quietly. He told no one about the third map. Not yet. It was his secret clue, the piece that unraveled all others. He sat in silence for the rest of the evening, his mind arranging the final act like pieces on a chessboard. Because now he knew where the enemy was hidden, not in shadows, but in design. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The next morning arrived sharp and cold, the lake glassy beneath a sky of washed silver. The Hôtel du Mont Lac stirred uneasily. The murder that had once seemed isolated, an echo of personal history, a clash of old rivalries, was no longer so easily contained. Rumors seeped through the corridors like mist. Guests whispered of spies and code maps, of missing girls in secret rooms, and though no new body had been found, the weight of an invisible death had settled on everyone's shoulders. At the center of it all was Hercule Poirot. He moved deliberately through the halls, observing the people more than the place. They were fraying, subtly but visibly. Oscar Gerber had grown erratic. At breakfast, he demanded the concierge send a telegram to Bern, immediately and in code. He refused to eat, tapping his spoon against the rim of his coffee cup like a metronome. Irina Lavelle had stopped wearing earrings. She lingered in corners, watching conversations like a hawk studying prey. When Poirot passed her in the corridor, she offered a stiff smile, and a single word, careful. And Gregor Van, the journalist, had begun asking questions of his own. Hastings spotted him outside the kitchen doors with a bellhop, scribbling feverishly in his notebook. Even Inspector Fournier appeared rattled. He pulled Poirot aside before noon. "We've found no trace of the girl. If she's truly escaped, she's left no trail. And Barras, he's vanished. His room is empty, luggage gone. No witness saw him leave." Poirot nodded, unsurprised. "He was a man walking a tightrope," Poirot said. "Now he's fallen, into hiding or into the hands of someone who feared what he knew." Fournier lowered his voice. "If what you said about the Cold War connections is true." "Poirot, this is no longer just a murder investigation. This is a diplomatic breach." Poirot gave a small shrug. "Is it not always so, mon ami? A crime is never just the act. It is the echo it creates." That afternoon, Poirot asked the hotel staff to summon all key guests, Gerber, Lavelle, Van, and Marguerite Sylvester, to the library for a preliminary clarification. The term was vague by design. He wanted unease. He wanted pressure. They gathered by the tall windows overlooking the terrace, none seated, each wary. Poirot entered last, walking slowly with his hands behind his back. "I thank you all for coming," he said, voice mild. "I believe we are close to a resolution. But before that, we must discuss a question that has been too long avoided." He turned to the fireplace, then faced them once more. "The forgery." Oscar shifted visibly. Irina flinched. Van pretended to write something, but his pen wasn't moving. Poirot continued. "Madame Durand did not die because of jealousy or blackmail or fear of exposure, at least not in the ordinary sense. She died because her map contained something that was never meant to be seen again." Oh, he paused. No one spoke. "You all know this," Poirot said. "In some way or another. You've each protected a secret, but now the walls are thin. They tremble." He turned to Irina. "Your aunt forged the base design, yes?" Irina's lips parted. "She traced it for someone," she said at last. "I never knew who. I only know that when she realized what it had become, she broke ties. She went into hiding. She never forgave herself." Poirot nodded gently. She saw the map as art. Others saw it as a blueprint for action. He turned next to Gerber. "You purchased that map not for its monetary value, but because you recognized its secondary purpose, didn't you?" Gerber said nothing, but his pale face answered for him. "And you, Monsieur Van," Poirot said, moving to the journalist, "came here expecting a story about a long-lost map-maker, but your father, he once handled Cold War intelligence, did he not?" Van looked up slowly. "He died believing he had destroyed all the evidence." "But the map lived on," Poirot whispered. Marguerite Sylvester cleared her throat, voice frail but firm. "She told me someone else had revived the design," she said, "reactivated it. Not for profit, but for manipulation." Poirot turned to the group once more. "And that person is still among us." Gasps were suppressed. Irina took an involuntary step back. Gerber whispered something inaudible. Van closed his notebook. Poirot raised a hand for calm. "But not for long," he said softly. Later, alone with Hastings in their suite, Poirot walked to the window and looked out over the lake. The water had begun to stir again, this time in low, rhythmic waves. "They are beginning to fear one another," he said. "They should," Hastings replied. "You've made it clear. This isn't over." "No," Poirot said, "but now they will start making mistakes." He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out the third map, the one recovered from the annex. Still folded, still marked with Annalise's name, and beneath it, another detail even Hastings hadn't noticed. A date. August 9th. Today. Poirot's expression darkened. "She circled the 9th, he murmured. "Today was meant to be the final act." Hastings leaned in. "You think another death is planned?" Poirot's hand closed around the compass. "I think." If we do not intervene, the curtain will fall on one more innocent life. He stepped away from the window, but not if Hercule Poirot is watching. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The hour approached quietly, as if the hotel itself understood what the date signified. August 9th. The day circled in faint ink on the third map. A cipher embedded in time. A message from the dead. A warning unheeded. And yet, Hercule Poirot heeded it. The air was heavy by late afternoon. Clouds loomed low over Lake Geneva, casting a grey veil upon the mirrored surface. The guests at the Hôtel du Mont-Lac moved with anxious stiffness. Poirot noted the subtle signs. Oscar Gerber no longer spoke to anyone. Irina Lavelle avoided eye contact. Gregor Van clutched his notebook as if it might deflect a bullet. All three had begun to retreat into themselves, and Poirot understood why. They knew something was coming. And Poirot intended to greet it first. He chose the terrace deliberately, just as Celestine Durand had chosen it. The same place, the same hour. Hastings hovered nearby, uneasy. "Are you sure, Poirot? You're drawing them out into the open." "Precisely," Poirot replied. "This is the bait. Let them think the circle will complete. Let them believe they can control what happens next." He took the compass from his coat pocket, the one belonging to Madame Durand, and placed it gently on the table. Its aged brass caught the dimming light, the needles spinning as though aware of what approached. "I shall remain visible," Poirot said. "That is the key." The trap would be silence. The trigger. Timing. At 6:37 p.m., a folded note was slipped under Poirot's suite door. It was addressed simply, "M.P. Poirot," unfolded it carefully. 4 words. You missed one symbol. There was no signature, only the same ink that marked the third map. He smiled. "Excellent," he murmured. "They are beginning to sweat." Hastings furrowed his brow. "You think the killer wrote it?" "No," Poirot replied. "The killer would never warn. But someone else involved. Someone who fears I'm getting too close." He stood, buttoning his coat. "Come, mon ami." "It is time." At 7 p.m., the terrace was prepared again. Candles lit, a bottle of wine on the table, chairs set just as they had been on the night of the murder. Poirot sat precisely where Celestine had once sat, alone, waiting. Hastings lingered in the shadows of the garden, watching. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the footsteps came, soft, measured, shoes designed not to click against stone. The figure emerged slowly from the archway. Not Gerber, not Lavelle. Gregor Van. He approached the table with a composed face and a slow, sardonic smile. "Odd," he said. "When I imagined confronting you, Poirot, it wasn't at a dinner table." Poirot smiled warmly. "But of course. Even truths deserve a little ceremony." Van sat without invitation, setting his notebook down beside the compass. "You know, I never wanted this," he said. "Not really." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet you came." "I came for answers." "Or to silence them?" Van's eyes narrowed. "You think I killed her?" Poirot didn't blink. "I think you are your father's son." Silence. The lake behind them rippled softly. "I found the early drafts," Van said. "Among his things after he died. I didn't understand them at first, but when I researched Camille Lavelle, it became clear. The map was never about borders. It was about movements, patterns, covert logistics." He glanced at the compass. "It was a kill map, wasn't it?" Poirot said nothing. Van leaned forward. "She knew. Madame Durand. She knew my father was involved, that the map he submitted during his tenure was falsified, altered from her designs. He never forgave himself. But he never told the full truth." "And you?" Poirot asked. Van's eyes glittered. "I wanted to find it." I wanted to publish it, the real story, the network behind it. But then I learned there was still someone protecting the secrets within that map. Someone who silenced Celestine? Van hesitated. Not me. Poirot leaned back. But you were here. You followed her movements. You spoke to Émile Barras. I thought he could give me the final piece. He did more than that, Poirot said calmly. He gave you a list of names, and you ran them through your channels, found who was still alive, who still had something to lose. Van went still. Poirot lowered his voice. You did not kill Madame Durand, but you triggered the hand that did, and you knew that if I reached the same conclusion, you would be next. He stood. Van's face darkened. What now? Now? Poirot said quietly. We wait. One more guest has not yet arrived. It happened at 7:17 p.m. A shot rang out, not from the terrace, but from the roof. Hastings sprang forward. Van ducked. Poirot remained absolutely still. The bullet struck the empty chair across from Poirot's, shattering the wine glass that had been placed there. Seconds later, Fournier and two officers emerged from the western stairwell, dragging a figure between them. Oscar Gerber. Sweat drenched his collar. In his coat pocket was a snub-nosed pistol, warm to the touch. His expression was blank. He confessed before he fired, Fournier said breathlessly. Told the bellboy he'd end the lie himself. Poirot nodded slowly. A man who forged death so many times could not abide seeing his masterpiece undone. Van exhaled shakily, stepping back from the table. Poirot turned to him. You were never the killer, Monsieur Van, but you were the catalyst, and now you must decide whether you become the witness history needs or the next name buried in silence. Van didn't reply, but he nodded, and that was enough. Later, alone in his suite, Poirot unfolded the third map once more. The symbols, the curves, the hidden pressure marks. It was a canvas of death, but also of truth. And Madame Durand, in the end, had spoken loudest by what she left behind. She did not die in vain, Poirot whispered, but she died because no one listened soon enough. Hastings poured a quiet glass of brandy. You've unmasked a killer, he said. But something tells me this isn't the end. Poirot smiled faintly. No, mon ami. It is merely the reveal. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The night deepened with a tension that could no longer be soothed by the gentle lap of lake water or the warm lights of the Hôtel du Mont Lac. Though Oscar Gerber had been taken into custody and the shot had missed its mark, the sense of finality had not come. There was no applause, no exhale of relief. If anything, Poirot sensed the pressure building, rising quietly behind the facade of containment. For the killer, Gerber was convenient, but he had not been the architect. That person, Poirot knew, was still free. And now, very likely, frightened. I think, Poirot murmured as he traced the worn edge of the third map, we have reached the moment where our culprit will act irrationally. Hastings looked up from the window where he had been watching the shadowed terrace below. What makes you so certain? Because the plan has failed, Poirot replied. Gerber was to be the closure. A false ending to a tangled story, but I did not bite, and now the true culprit sees only one option. He looked at his pocket watch. 11:03 p.m. Escape. Downstairs, the hotel staff had begun to retire, but the air in the lobby remained thick with whispers. Fournier had posted 2 officers at the back entrance and 1 at the boathouse. Yet Poirot requested one more precaution, a watch on the main lift. Whoever they are, he said softly, they are clever. They will not flee through shadows. They will flee through the front door. Hastings blinked. You think they'll walk out? I think they will glide, Poirot corrected. In silk, in charm, and with impeccable timing. The clock struck 11:20 when Irena Lavelle descended the east stair. She was dressed in travel clothes, navy trousers, a high-collared coat, gloves. Her hair was pinned into a sleek bun, and over one shoulder she carried a rolled artist's tube. She moved like someone who had not slept, but who had, at last, made a decision. Poirot stepped into the corridor from behind the velvet curtain. "Mademoiselle," he said gently. She froze. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. She turned slowly. "I need to return to Marseille. My performance is in 2 days." "You cancelled the performance this morning," he said. Her composure cracked slightly. "I've changed my mind." Poirot walked toward her with calm, unhurried steps. "You are not leaving for a performance. You are leaving because the map is no longer yours to control." "I never claimed—" "Non," Poirot interrupted softly. "You never spoke of authorship, but you treated it like an heirloom, and now that Oscar Gerber has been taken, you believe your burden has lifted." She gripped the tube more tightly. Poirot glanced at it. "Is it the original?" "Just sketches." "May I see them?" "No." Poirot tilted his head. "Because they are not sketches. They are the plates, the ones your aunt left you." Silence. Then, very softly, "She told me never to share them. And yet you came here." "She was my family," Irena whispered. "The only one who ever believed I was more than an echo. She forged the map for them. They used it to kill people. She tried to undo it, but it was too late. She vanished, lived under another name for years. I watched her deteriorate from guilt." "And now you carry it," Poirot said. "Not just the legacy, the evidence." She looked down. "I thought I could control it. By whomping Gerber into a public arrest? I didn't know he'd try to shoot you." "No," Poirot said. "But you knew he would break. Just as you knew Gregor Van would trace the map's lineage. You planted just enough truth for the rest of us to follow a trail, while you slipped away before the real weight of it fell." Tears shimmered at the edge of her gaze, but she blinked them back with defiance. "You don't understand what it's like to live in someone else's guilt. All I ever wanted was to do right by her, to show the map meant something more." "It does," Poirot said gently, "which is why you cannot carry it into silence." He reached out slowly and placed his hand over the canvas tube. "Forgeries are not just lies," he said. "They are wounds, and this one has bled enough." She did not resist when he lifted it from her hands. She only said, "They'll still come for it." "I know," Poirot replied. "Which is why it will not leave my sight." Back in Poirot's suite, Hastings locked the door behind them. Irena sat near the window, pale and quiet. Poirot unrolled the contents of the tube with delicate fingers. Inside were the original plates. The layering technique was precise. Duran's contours, Lavelle's overlays, the symbolic annotations hidden between the ridges of mountains, and then, near the bottom right corner, faint but unmistakable, a third hand. Someone had added coordinates. Not in ink, but in pressed impressions. Numbers that aligned not with geography, but with transport routes, schedules, timings. It had been a planning document for years. Poirot turned to Hastings. "This is the master map, the one used for operations across borders. With these, one could track the movement of diplomatic convoys, agents, even defectors. It was not merely a forgery. It was a code book." Hastings exhaled. "And you think the killings were to protect this?" Poirot nodded. "Celestine found her original altered. Camille traced it without knowing, and someone, perhaps within an intelligence network, converted it into something far more lethal. And Irena. She was never the killer," Poirot said, "but she was the custodian of a truth too dangerous to remain in the dark." He returned the plates to their case. "She tried to disappear with it, but secrets," he added, "do not disappear. They only wait." Outside, the lake stretched dark and still. Poirot stared into the distance. The final piece is in place. Tomorrow, we reveal the whole of it. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The dawn that followed was not soft. It arrived over Lake Geneva in a wash of silver-gray, cold and stern, as if it too had decided the truth had waited long enough. From the terrace, Poirot watched the waters begin to stir beneath the wind, his reflection dim in the glass door behind him. The plates, those slivers of overlapping cartographic deceit, now lay in his possession, and at last the design was clear. It had never been about borders. It had been about timing. At 6 a.m., Poirot convened a meeting in the hotel's small conference salon, an austere, wood-paneled room lined with maps from decades past, some genuine, some decorative. Inspector Fournier arrived first, still grim from the night before. Hastings followed close behind, carrying the case containing the map plates. Gregor Van appeared next, face pale, eyes rimmed red. Irena Lavelle entered silently after him, seated herself at the far end of the table, and stared at her gloved hands. Only Marguerite Sylvestre was absent. Her health too frail, Poirot had insisted she remain in her room. They waited. Poirot stood at the head of the table, his hands folded before him. "My friends," he began quietly, "you have been drawn into something vast, but we are nearly at the end. There is one final pattern to see, one final truth to face." He nodded to Hastings, who unrolled the 3 overlaid plates onto the long table. "Here," Poirot said, gesturing to the first layer, "is Celestine Durand's original terrain. Elegant, natural, a map of the real." He pointed to the second layer. "Here is the forgery, crafted by Camille Lavelle. We now know she was commissioned under false pretenses to trace the map's framework, believing it to be part of a government archival request. But note, her work here is mirrored, stylized, repeating." Poirot stepped back. And then, the third hand. He gestured toward the final overlay. The pressed marks, faint at first glance but damning under direct light. These symbols are not topographic, they are logistical, timetables, courier paths, intelligence checkpoints. Cross-reference them with Cold War records and you find 7 coinciding incidents, 7 covert deaths, each linked to locations embedded on this altered map. Fournier's jaw tightened. "You're saying this map enabled those deaths?" "No," Poirot said. "I'm saying it planned them." He paused, letting that hang in the air. "There was a department, deep within European intelligence, I suspect. A quiet branch, off-record. The forged cartography unit, perhaps. It would appear they believed the safest way to pass operational data was through terrain itself. Who questions a map? After all." Hastings exhaled. "But Celestine found out." "Yes," Poirot said. "Years later, when she saw a distorted version of her own work in an academic archive, a forgery mimicking her hand, but betraying its origin with unnatural symmetry. She traced it, found the overlapping deaths, and came here to confront it." Poirot turned to Gregor Van. "You, monsieur, were the spark. The son of a former intelligence clerk. Your research into Cold War disappearances led you to her name. You contacted her, did you not?" Van hesitated. "I sent her a letter asking if she had ever contributed to a project titled Cartographia Privée. I didn't expect her to reply." "But she did," Poirot said. "She returned here because of your letter, because she believed you could help expose the truth, but the truth," he added, "had other guardians." He stepped around the table. "And this brings us to Oscar Gerber." Everyone looked toward the vacant seat where Gerber had sat just hours before. Poirot continued. "Gerber was no killer, but he was an instrument, a buyer, a facilitator. He knew of the plates, had seen them once, years ago. He recognized their worth, not as art, but as insurance. And when Madame Durand arrived, he panicked. Fournier frowned. So he killed her? No, Poirot said, but he enabled it. He paused. The fatal shot came from the garden's lower slope, angled just enough to avoid drawing attention from the terrace. It was not Gerber's gun, nor was it fired from above, as we were led to believe. That was staged. I now believe Gerber had been promised protection until he became a liability. Poirot's voice dropped. And that protection came from someone with access to all sides of the game, the plates, the forgery, the guests, the staff. He turned to face Irena. No, he said softly. Not you, mademoiselle. Her head rose slightly in confusion. Poirot looked past her, toward the entry door. The room fell still. Footsteps. The door opened, and into the room stepped Marguerite Sylvestre, supported by a cane, eyes sharp despite her trembling frame. Fournier stood. What? Poirot raised a hand. Madame Sylvestre, he said, was not merely Celestine's oldest friend. She was her colleague. The two worked together in the 1980s on classified cartography for various governments. Marguerite's name never appeared on the credits, but she had access to the same materials. She knew the maps intimately. Marguerite's face remained unreadable. Celestine always believed the forgery had one signature, Poirot continued, but what she never considered, until the final weeks of her life, was that there had been two. He stepped toward the elderly woman, speaking now with solemnity. You were there, weren't you? When Camille Lavelle's plates were commissioned, you were the one who delivered the specifications. Not for an academic archive, but for a covert mapping system. No one spoke. Marguerite's cane trembled. Then she gripped it tighter. I never thought she'd come back, she said quietly. Poirot nodded. You loved her, but you also feared what she would do with what she'd uncovered. Marguerite closed her eyes. It was meant to protect us, a way to know what others were doing without compromising codes. But it went too far. When people began dying, I tried to pull away. They wouldn't let me. I told myself I was just the technician. Poirot's voice was gentle, but you watched her die. Marguerite opened her eyes. They shimmered. I didn't pull the trigger. No, Poirot said. But you enabled the one who did. You sent the signal. You made the call. Marguerite sank into the nearest chair as if the truth had physically uncoiled from her and left her hollow. I never wanted this, she whispered. I only wanted to keep it buried. Poirot folded his hands. But truth, madame, is a tide. It waits, and then it returns. Outside, the lake remained still, but the wind had shifted. The storm, at last, was beginning to break. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The confession settled over the room like dust falling on a crypt, soft, inevitable, and ancient. Marguerite Sylvestre sat still in her chair, her cane forgotten at her side, her eyes half-lidded as though the past, now spoken aloud, had become too heavy to carry. No one dared move. Even Inspector Fournier remained frozen in place, stunned not by the admission itself, but by its quiet, almost sorrowful clarity. Hercule Poirot stood at the head of the table, unmoved by the silence. He had expected the storm, but it had arrived as a whisper instead of thunder. It was always the quiet ones, he thought, the ones who do not need power because they already hold it, in knowledge, in memory, in placement just outside the circle of suspicion. Poirot spoke softly, and so, you understand now, mes amis, why Madame Durand had to die. She wasn't going to publish, Irina said faintly. She wanted to warn, she wanted to cleanse the record. Marguerite gave a fragile, bitter smile. Yes, but warning is dangerous, my dear. It opens doors others have sealed, and those doors lead to rooms still occupied. Fournier finally found his voice. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've admitted, madame? These maps, these deaths, this goes beyond personal betrayal." "Yes," she said. "It always did." Poirot stepped forward, careful and deliberate. "You were the second hand on the forgery. You weren't just complicit. You enhanced it. You added the logistical layer, the pressed coordinates." "I did," she said, nodding once. "And I never believed she would return to it. I thought she had let it go, that we all had, until I received the letter." Hastings frowned. "You mean the letter from Gregor Van?" Marguerite shook her head. "No, one from Celestine, weeks before her arrival." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "She warned you. She asked me to stand with her," Marguerite said, "to come forward, to name what we'd done. She said, 'The truth is already out there, but it will mean nothing if it comes without us.'" Irina's breath caught. "She was offering you redemption," Poirot murmured. "I couldn't take it," Marguerite whispered. "I couldn't face what we'd started. But worse, I feared what the others would do if she tried." "Who else?" Fournier pressed. "Who did you fear?" Marguerite looked up at him, weary, fading. "I don't know their names. That was the design, compartmentalized. We passed messages, requests, coordinates. We never saw faces. That was the brilliance of the cartographic layer. It allowed total deniability." "But you had a way to signal them," Poirot said. "To warn them." She nodded. "A single coordinate pressed into the plates. They told me if I ever suspected a leak, mark it, and leave the map somewhere visible. They would know." Poirot turned to the maps on the table. "And so you did. You took her final copy, pressed the symbol, placed it near the salon." "I didn't think they would kill her," Marguerite said. "I thought they'd scare her away again." "But she was no longer afraid," Irina whispered. "No," Poirot said. "She was ready. She had accepted the consequences." Gregor Van's voice broke the silence. "So who killed her?" Poirot looked at him. A professional, one of the silent names. A man who came not to threaten, but to erase. We will never know which guest or staff member it was, because the room was full of shadows, and she was alone. Fournier exhaled. "And the girl Annalise?" "She is safe," Poirot said, "because Emile Barra, though cowardly, did one brave thing before he fled. He got her out." Fournier nodded slowly. "Then it ends here." "No," Poirot said. "It ends when every truth is heard." At 3 p.m., Poirot requested the hotel prepare the ballroom, not for another recital nor a tribute, but a formal gathering, one final address. By 4 the guests had been summoned. They came in silence, some confused, some wary. The rumors had churned, but no one yet understood the full scope of what had unfolded. The musicians stood in a cluster by the piano. The concierge lingered near the rear doors. Even the young waiters stood still, polishing silver that did not need polishing. Poirot stepped onto the small dais. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "a terrible thing has occurred under this roof. But it did not begin here. It began decades ago with a decision made in secret, to use the tools of science and art for the purpose of control." He gestured to the far wall where a projected image of the map had been displayed. "This," he said, "is a forgery, but not a clumsy one, a beautiful one, designed not to imitate, but to conceal. It is a map overlaid with intention. It sent people to their deaths. It created corridors where assassinations could take place unnoticed. It tracked the rhythm of danger across Europe." Gasps stirred. "And one of its architects was among us. A woman torn by guilt, who ultimately chose silence over truth. Another, a brilliant cartographer, discovered its deception. She tried to stop it. She tried to warn us." He paused. "And she was murdered." No one moved. Poirot continued. "The woman's name was Madame Celestine Durand. Some of you met her. Some feared her. Some used her work, but none of you knew her courage." He allowed a long moment to pass. Then, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, he said, "I knew her." The room exhaled as one. Poirot stepped down. Hastings met him at the base of the stage, eyes full of emotion. "You've told them," Hastings said. "But will it matter?" Poirot looked across the silent ballroom. "Yes," he said, "because now the shadows have faces and the silence has cracks." Outside, the lake had turned gold with the lowering sun. The mountains, long silent witnesses, stood bathed in light. Poirot stood at the edge of the promenade, hands behind his back, his coat tugged gently by the breeze. Justice had not arrested everyone, but truth had named them, and for Hercule Poirot, that was where justice always began. Chapter 16. The Reveal. That evening, the Hôtel du Mont Lac was quieter than it had been in days, not with the silence of fear, but with the stillness that follows understanding. The guests spoke in hushed tones, if at all. No music drifted from the lounge. No laughter echoed in the corridors. Even the clinking of cutlery at dinner seemed subdued, as though the very walls now knew what they had witnessed. In the South Salon, Hercule Poirot prepared for the final gathering. Not a spectacle, but a reckoning. He had allowed the story to unfold slowly, giving guilt room to squirm and truth room to grow. But now, at last, it was time to name the shadow behind the curtain. He had requested only 6 people attend: Irene Lavelle, Gregor Van, Inspector Fournier, Marguerite Sylvester, Hastings, and the hotel's general manager. The rest had been politely turned away. At 9 p.m., the doors were shut. The salon smelled faintly of sandalwood and old paper. A single oil lamp lit the center of the table, casting soft, wavering light upon the 3 maps laid out in succession: the original by Celestine, the forgery by Camille Lavelle, and the deadly overprint, layered with pressed marks and buried orders. Poirot stood at the head of the table, immaculate in grey. "Mes amis," he began, his voice calm, "we have reached the final clarity, but before I speak the name that lies beneath the final symbol, I must explain how this crime unfolded, not in one moment, but over decades." They listened in silence. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Poirot gestured to the maps. As we have seen, Madame Durand's original cartography was co-opted. Camille Lavelle traced it under orders. The addition of symmetrical overlays and subtle geocodes converted the map into a covert operations ledger, a spatial index for clandestine movement. He turned to the final map. But the overprint, the pressing of data not in ink, but through pressure, was not the work of Lavelle. It was added later, by someone else. He looked toward Marguerite Sylvester. "You admitted to being the messenger, the liaison between Lavelle and those who commissioned the project. You even confessed to sending a signal by pressing a coordinate into the salon map. A warning." Marguerite looked down, fingers tightening around her cane. "But you were not the final architect," Poirot said gently. "You carried the matches. But someone else lit the fire." He turned slowly. His eyes landed on Gregor Van. Van stiffened. "I told you, I contacted Celestine after finding her name linked to my father's records. That's all." "You did more than that," Poirot said softly. "You were not simply an observer. You were the final link." Van's eyes narrowed. "You're accusing me of being the killer." "No," Poirot replied. "You are the curator of the truth, the one who pieced together the fragments and realized what the map truly meant." He stepped closer. "But in doing so, you also realized something else, something far more dangerous. That if you were the first to control the plates, to own the scandal, to publish the findings, you could rewrite history. You would not just be a journalist. You would be the voice of revelation." Van's face paled. Poirot nodded. "You began by seeking the truth, But then you saw opportunity. And when you found the old forgery in your father's documents, you knew where it led. You followed the trail to Lavelle, to Duran, and eventually to Sylvester. I didn't kill her, Van said, voice trembling. No, Poirot agreed. You didn't pull the trigger, but you did deliver the name. You leaked Celestine's return to the only person capable of erasing her cleanly. He paused. The true orchestrator, the ghost behind the forgery, the one whose initials were hidden beneath a symbol on the third map. He tapped a spot near the lake's western bank, where a delicate triangle had been pressed faintly into the paper. Poirot drew a circle around it and revealed the inscription barely visible beneath the overlay. LFS Fournier looked confused. Lucien Favreau. Poirot shook his head. No, it never stood for him. Those were her initials, the real forger. The silent figure behind the layering of operations and death. He turned to the table's final guest. The general manager of the hotel, a tall man with a weathered face, a perpetual smile, and, for decades, a perfect view of every arrival, every departure, every change in staff and scenery. Laurent Félix Savard. The man did not flinch. Poirot's voice dropped. You were with the Swiss diplomatic corps before you vanished from the records. You held posts in logistics. You worked in document control. You knew the map project from the beginning. Still, no response. You were the one who gave Lavelle the tracing commission. You were the one who refined it. You pressed the symbols. You finalized the operational codes. And when Celestine returned, you ordered her death. Savard looked up at last. I never meant to kill her, he said. His voice was dry, flat, exhausted. Poirot said nothing. Savard continued. The operation had already ended. The codes were obsolete. I thought, if I let her speak, the scandal would ignite. People would see conspiracies where there were none. You made yourself the custodian of silence, Poirot said quietly. Savard nodded. And you broke it. Poirot folded his hands. Justice does not always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives with understanding. He turned to Fournier. I leave him in your hands, Inspector, but be aware, you will face pressure from above. Records will be sealed. Names erased, but not all of them. Not this time. Fournier stood. He'll be detained. Quietly. Savard did not resist. As he was led from the room, Poirot returned to the table. He gently rolled up the maps, one by one, and placed them back into the case. These, he said, no longer belong to governments. They belong to history. He looked to Irena, to Van, to Hastings. Let the silence end with us. Outside, the sky had turned obsidian, stars shivering faintly above the lake. Poirot walked alone along the water's edge, his shoes quiet on the stone path. The air was cool, the breeze clean, and in his pocket the compass needle spun, finally, without interference. Tomorrow would bring questions, diplomatic calls, officials in grey suits. But for tonight at least, the map had been restored, and so had the truth. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The following morning unfolded not with fanfare, but with the subdued quiet of a hotel still absorbing its place in a far greater narrative. Guests moved slowly through breakfast, speaking in murmurs, glancing toward the windows that overlooked the lake, as if hoping to glimpse some final shape on the horizon. The staff, unusually formal, stepped lightly around the tables, instinctively aware that history had passed through their lobby and left shadows in its wake. In his suite, Hercule Poirot sat at a small writing desk beside the window, methodically trimming the edges of a letter. He was immaculate as always. His tie perfectly centered, his shoes glinting like glass. Yet there was a gravity in the room, a sense that something delicate had been resolved, but not without cost. Across from him, Hastings sipped tea with a thoughtful frown. So it's over, Hastings said quietly. Poirot did not look up. "Non, mon ami. It is finished, but it is not over." Hastings blinked. "You mean the trial?" Poirot shook his head. "There may be no trial. Laurent Félix Savard will likely vanish into the fold from which he emerged. There will be files, redacted, interviews, classified, and behind it all, a slow, polite forgetting. But that's not justice." Poirot lifted his eyes. "It is not vengeance, no. But justice? Justice is not always loud. It does not always arrive in courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives in the knowing." In truth being whispered loud enough for history to listen, he folded the letter and sealed it with a wax press bearing his initials. On the envelope, the name Anneliese Grunewald. He slid it into a leather pouch, along with a duplicate of the original plates, minus the overlaid codes. "She will carry the rest," he said. "She is the only one who knew this map for what it truly was before any of us caught up." Hastings frowned. "Isn't it dangerous to let her have that?" Poirot gave a soft smile. "She has no desire for politics, only for honesty, and I trust her more than any official I've met." He rose, placing the pouch carefully into his travel satchel. "Come, Hastings. The car arrives soon, but before we depart, we must pay a final visit." They made their way to the garden terrace, where Inspector Fournier waited beneath the pergola, arms crossed, face hard with sleep deprivation and quiet triumph. He offered a nod of respect as Poirot approached. "Savard has been transferred," he said simply. "No resistance, no press." "Good," Poirot said. He was never a man of noise. Fournier's gaze lingered on the distant lake. "You know, I've worked cases of corruption, bribes, even war crimes, but this felt like chasing fog, a map that didn't lead to places, but to ghosts." Poirot nodded. "Because the ghosts built it." He gestured for Fournier to walk with him along the hedge path. The three men strolled in silence until they reached a bench beneath a copper beech. There, already seated, was Marguerite Sylvestre. The morning sun had not yet warmed the cool air when Hercule Poirot and Hastings stood quietly on the terrace overlooking Lake Geneva. The mist still curled over the water like a secret, but beneath it the world had shifted, changed irrevocably by the truth finally unveiled. The guests at the Hôtel du Mont Lac moved with the tentative grace of those who have witnessed the unraveling of carefully woven deceptions, unsure of what to say or whom to trust. Poirot, impeccable as ever in his grey suit and perfectly groomed mustache, held a small leather pouch in his hand. Inside lay the original map plates, now stripped of their deadly secrets and ready to be entrusted to the one person who could safeguard them. Anneliese Grunewald. She had been spirited away safely, protected from those who sought to bury the truth once and for all. Hastings broke the silence. "So, it's truly over." Poirot's gaze lingered on the calm lake. "It is finished, but never truly over. There will be those who wish to forget, to silence the echoes of what happened here. But justice is a river, Hastings. It may be dammed, diverted, even dried in places, but it always finds a way to the sea." Inspector Fournier joined them, his face marked by exhaustion but a glimmer of satisfaction shining through. "Savard is in custody. The higher-ups will try to keep things quiet, but the evidence is irrefutable." Poirot inclined his head. "Justice may be quiet, but it is no less real." They turned toward the hotel, where Marguerite Sylvestre awaited. The frail woman sat beneath the copper beech tree, her hands wrapped around a silk scarf embroidered with delicate symbols, a silent testament to the life she had lived, intertwined with secrets. "Madame Sylvestre," Poirot greeted softly. She smiled faintly. "Monsieur Poirot, I feared you might not come." "We promised the truth would be spoken," he said. "And so it has." She nodded. "The weight is lighter now, but it does not disappear." "No," Poirot agreed, "but it is carried with dignity. You chose to face what others fled." Marguerite's eyes glistened. "I did what I could, and that is all any of us can do." As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the lake, Poirot gathered the original maps, the plates, and the compass that had guided him through the labyrinth of lies and shadows. "These," he said, "are no longer weapons or tools of concealment. They are pieces of history." Hastings looked at him. "And what will you do with them?" Poirot smiled. "They will be entrusted to Annalise, the one who holds the future." He paused, then added, "And I will write their story, not as a crime, but as a caution, that truth, no matter how deeply hidden, has a way of finding the light." They walked slowly back into the hotel, leaving behind the terrace and the secrets it had held. The guests had gathered to hear the final word, to bear witness to the unraveling of a decades-old conspiracy, and to find some peace in its resolution. Poirot paused in the lobby, glancing once more at the glistening lake beyond the windows. "Justice," he mused, "is often quiet and slow, but when it comes, it is undeniable." And with that, Hercule Poirot turned, his ever-present confidence and quiet wisdom carrying him forward into whatever new mysteries awaited, leaving behind a world a little clearer, a little safer, and a little more just. She looked thinner than she had the day before, her eyes distant but no longer evasive. Her hands rested in her lap, wrapped around a silk scarf embroidered with geometric shapes, quiet symbols of her trade. "Madame?" Poirot greeted gently. She looked up with a soft smile. "Monsieur Poirot, I wondered if you'd come. I promised you yesterday the truth would be spoken. Today I come not with questions, but with peace." She closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you." He sat beside her, Hastings and Fournier remaining respectfully behind. "You chose not to run," Poirot said. "That, I believe, was your first step toward healing." "There's nowhere to run when the guilt lives inside your own skin," she replied. "Will you face charges?" "Perhaps, perhaps not. But I will not leave. I'll remain here. This hotel, this place, was my silence for too long. Now it must become my memory." Poirot looked at her hands. And what of Camille Lavelle's legacy? She did what she believed was safe. But she died with regret. I will not do the same. Poirot stood, bowed slightly, and took her hand in both of his. "Then you will outlive the shadow." As he turned to leave, Marguerite called out softly, "Poirot." "Yes, madame." "She used to say, Celestine, maps are only dangerous when they're wrong." Poirot smiled. "Then perhaps this one, at last, is right." By noon, Poirot and Hastings were packed and ready. As the car rolled gently down the winding road from the Hôtel du Mont Lac, Poirot looked out at the passing trees, the still lake, the mountains wrapped in late summer haze. He touched the edge of the compass in his pocket, the one Celestine had left behind. Hastings, watching him, finally asked, "You believed her the moment you saw her, didn't you?" Poirot nodded slowly. She had the look of a woman who had told the truth so many times that no one believed her anymore. "I've seen that look before. It is the face of someone with nothing left to hide." "And do you believe the rest will remain buried?" Poirot turned toward him, a glint in his eye. "Non, mon ami. The world is changing, slowly, but maps, real maps, do not stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone finds the coordinates." He leaned back in his seat, and when they do, perhaps they will read this one, not as a weapon, but as a warning. Far behind them, on a bench by the water, Marguerite watched the road disappear. And in the salon above, a maid dusted the glass case where the maps had been displayed. Inside the case, now empty, only one thing remained, a small card, in Poirot's handwriting. "La vérité, comme les montagnes, ne s'effondre jamais." Hercule Poirot. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The Hôtel du Mont Lac lay wrapped in the quiet embrace of twilight, the sky a soft canvas of deep blues and purples above the tranquil lake. Inside the Grand Salon, the guests who remained gathered in small groups, whispers mingling with the fading strains of a lone piano. Outside, the world felt as though it was holding its breath, awaiting the last word. Hercule Poirot stood apart near the fireplace, his gaze distant yet focused. Around him, the threads of the long tangled mystery had been drawn tight, each character's secret unveiled, each deception unraveled. The final piece had fallen into place, not with a shout, but with the subtle certainty of a closing curtain. He turned to the assembled circle and began, his voice calm, measured. Mesdames et messieurs, throughout this investigation, we have walked together through shadows of the past, maps forged and lives lost, silence imposed and truth concealed. Madame Célestine Durand returned not merely as a cartographer, but as a guardian of history's hidden paths. She sought to bring light where darkness had long prevailed. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The layers of forgery, the pressed symbols, the secret deaths, they were not the work of one, but many. A conspiracy woven through decades, hidden beneath lines of ink and the quiet of forgotten corridors. Yet it was human courage, hers and those who dared to follow the trail, that broke the cycle. Poirot's eyes met those of each listener, lingering with quiet intensity. Justice, however, is not always loud. It is not always swift. Often it is found in the patient gathering of small truths, the persistent tracing of hidden marks, and the unwavering refusal to let silence reign. He smiled gently, his famed mustache twitching. And so, as the night falls on this place, I offer this reflection. La vérité, comme les montagnes, ne s'effondre jamais. Truth, like the mountains, never collapses. It endures. It waits. A soft murmur rippled through the room. Poirot stepped back, his work complete. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath the first stars, the gentle ripple of water singing a timeless lullaby. Hastings approached quietly. "You are magnificent," he said softly. Poirot nodded. "Merci, Hastings." But the true marvel is that even in a world of maps and shadows, the little grey cells can find the way. Together, they left the salon, stepping into the cool night. The mystery had ended. But the search for truth, Poirot knew, would always continue, and with that, the great detective vanished into the night, his legacy sealed like the maps he so carefully deciphered, timeless, enduring, and forever guiding the way.